Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML 303. This is the long pseudo-historical afterlife of the Templars. Now, I thought it might be worthwhile to start with a brief sketch of who the Templars were, historically speaking. I know that some of you may not have all the background, so you might call this establishing a baseline. So the Templar order was created in Jerusalem after the First Crusade. Their original duty was to protect pilgrims. They were essentially military monks or religious knights. Their first leader was Hugh de Payens, a French nobleman, and their first headquarters stood on the site, supposedly, of Solomon's Temple, which was beside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, hence the Knights of the Temple or the Templars. Now, in their early years, they lived fairly undramatically. They were essentially monks. They practiced poverty, chastity, and obedience. They actually lived under the Augustinian rule, believe it or not. But there was an inherent conflict here, because protection, so shedding blood, was their purpose for existence. This was not a standard way to serve God as a religious person, specifically as a person who was clerical in nature. You know, it is perhaps a secular way one can serve God, but for monks to shed blood, I'm not saying that none of them ever did, but it was generally not seen as socially acceptable. So this is a little odd, really. Now, they were a fairly obscure order until they caught the attention of Bernard of Clairvaux. So for those of you who are not familiar with Bernard, he was the chief preacher of the Second Crusade. He was the advisor to the King of France, the head of the Cistercian order. He is probably the most powerful churchman in his century. He is a bit of a kingmaker, you might say. Wasn't interested in being pope, but he had a lot of power. Now, he was fascinated by the Templars. He actually thought that holy knighthood was a wonderful thing. He popularized it through his writings, and he helped bring about the original Templar rule. Now, again, this wasn't received well by everyone. The knight is being blended with the monk. This is a weird sort of innovation. But it was accepted by most of the church and by the kings of Europe, which was much more important, because they tended to give the Templars things. Alfonso of Aragon tried to bequeath a third of his kingdom to the Templar order. So this meant their status rose, because they were given thousands of estates. They were made responsible for transmitting money and supplies to the Holy Land. This included the crusading tax, which was the first income tax that was collected in Europe. So in order to fulfill these duties, the Templars changed as an institution. They became bankers. They became members of the elite and on excellent terms with royalty. Now, while the Crusader states were in their final decline, a lot of the Templars were primarily focused on their holdings in Europe. They did maintain fortresses in the east, but that wasn't necessarily where their priority was. So what happens when they stop, being there to prevent the Crusaders from being defeated? That means they're looked at with a certain amount of suspicion. Now, they're also looked at with suspicion because they're involved in Eastern politics, and they're rich. So people began to question the Templars, why they still existed, and what their purpose was. Why were they benefiting so much from their previous status when they weren't supplying the services that they had initially supplied? So they get a reputation for being overly proud and prone to avarice. Primarily, this is a reputation amongst the church itself. Now, by the feudal lords, they were distrusted for engaging in money lending, so that blurring of lines was working against them. They were accused in several cases of giving poor counsel. So there are two historians, William of Tyre in the 12th century and Matthew Paris in the 13th, that spread lurid tales of how corrupt and foolhardy they were. Now, where they really ran into trouble was in their involvement with the Ismailis. So a lot of this we think was sort of made up after the fact. The Ismailis we know better as the Assassins, and yeah, for any of you who are Assassin's Creed fans, this is the group that initially inspired our favorite brotherhood. The Assassins supposedly paid them a yearly tribute. we don't really know if this is the case. When they were contemplating conversion to Christianity, which we also don't really know ever actually was being contemplated, the Templars decided, according to the story, that they didn't want to lose that money. So they had the leader of the assassins, not the leader of the assassins, his ambassador killed. Again, this is almost entirely made up, we're fairly sure. It is possible that they interfered with the diplomatic process somehow. Hard to say if they did it out of monetary interest or just, for other reasons that we may not be seeing. Now, the Templar Grand Master, during the time leading up to the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which is the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, is also blamed for a lot of what went wrong. This is Gerard de Riedfort. Apparently, he interfered with the succession, then was a terrible military leader, and made serious strategic errors. It's also worth pointing out that the Templars' relationship with the papacy had become very rocky over time. I mean, even as early as 1207, Innocent III, who is one of the greatest popes of the Middle Ages, issued a papal bull complaining that the Templars were actually sending out preachers, promising to break church interdicts for pay. Anybody know what an interdict is? Think about it for a moment. We know about excommunication, and actually part of the rumor was that they were offering burial to excommunicates if they paid to join the order. But an interdict is what happens when the church wants to collectively punish, an entire fief for what the Lord has done. And when the Lord is a king, that can mean the entire kingdom. So if you were going to lay England under an interdict because King John was misbehaving, you would prevent any religious services from being carried out in England. And that's a way of pressuring the king through his people. So offering people the opportunity to break interdicts for pay, not okay in the eyes of the church. And finally, Clement IV in the 1260s told the Grand Master of the order, stop goading me unless you want your papal protection revoked. He never followed up on that threat, but the relationship with the papacy never improved. Now, when Acre fell in 1291, and this is generally considered to be the end of the classic crusading period, the Templars actually fought nobly to try and defend the city, but when the city was lost, they were blamed for the failure. And when the survivors returned to the west and seemed to enjoy all of their old privileges, there's a lot of questions being raised. Now, it didn't help that the nature of chivalry had changed. The focus was now on the knight-errant and his personal quest. It wasn't always specifically a Christian form of knighthood. Certainly was not bound to military orders any longer. So what happened is a little odd, and you need a little bit of background to understand this, first of all. So accusations of witchcraft were an oddity that developed amongst the French nobility for a time in the early 14th century. This is not because French nobles suddenly started believing in witchcraft. It was used as a tool to get at your rivals. The court was very competitive. Oftentimes we think it was motivated by the desire for the money of the accused. And what typifies these accusations of witchcraft is that in most cases they're also accusations of heresy. So this is what happens to the Templars in 1307 at the behest of King Philip the Fair of France. So they are arrested en masse on suspicion of heresy. So this is 500 or more Templars. Very few got away, we think. They were arrested by the king's men, which was authorized by the papal inquisitor, and they were stripped all at once of their papal protections. Now, the French government claimed that their actions were all about religious zeal, but really, early on, even some contemporary critics said it's not about zeal, it's about the Templar bank. And when it's not about the bank, it's about people wanting to unify the two orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, into one, in which the French could then control. Now, Dante, by whom I mean the actual author of the Divine Comedy, actually wrote suggesting that it was all about money. Now, it also may have been partially a dispute over how to pursue the aims of the crusading movement. This is the king perhaps moving back into the arena trying to co-opt resources. So what the Templars are charged with is a really wacky variety of charges. So supposedly they denied Christ 3 times during the reception of a new Templar into the order. They said were said to have spat 3 times on a cross, various questionable sexual activities. And the thing that I always thought was really interesting is that they were accused of worshipping what we call a brazen head. So a brazen head is a medieval object that supposedly was in the shape of a man's head and could give you answers to simple questions, usually yes or no. Did these actually exist? Well, of course not. There is a lot of association of the idea of the brazen head with demons. The device is demonically possessed, that sort of thing. And Baphomet, the supposed brazen head, we don't really know what this was all about. And honestly, it may not have been about anything. I mean, the Templars were tortured in order to elicit their confessions. What wouldn't they have made up in order to get it to stop? So the individual Templars were condemned and the order itself was suppressed. The Pope was actually threatened with accusations of heresy if he didn't go along with the king's ideas here. But the implication is that it wasn't really necessary. Now, what happened is that many major officials of the order and many members were burned at the stake. The Grand Master and 3 of his closest officers were supposed to simply be imprisoned for life because they admitted their sins. But at the tribunal, they stood up in front of everyone and claimed that they were innocent. So that means that they were relapsed heretics and they were burned at the stake. So that is the story of what actually happened to the Templars, as much as we can put it together. What the actual motivations of Philip and the Pope were, may never be entirely clear. So where does the legend come from? Now, what's interesting is that the debate over the guilt of the Templars and the French king's motivations, happened almost as soon as the events themselves. It could be a religious or political object lesson, depending on what your perception was. If you were English, you could say, okay, here were corrupt religious men overthrown by the king, which is good. Roman historians might say the Pope was pressured to act by the French king, which was bad, because you shouldn't pressure the Pope. Surviving military orders might have said, the Templars didn't succeed in their purpose ever, so who cares what happens to them? Now, in 1531, Henry Cornelius Agrippa publishes his magical handbook. And this is about how demons and spirits and the powers inherent in them can be controlled. Now, he drags the Templars into his discussion as witches or heretics. He actually likens them to both the Bogomiles, who were duelists and predecessors of the Cathars, and this book is actually a bit of a book fad, insofar as any book in the 16th century can be a book fad. Magic, this kind of courtly gentleman's magic, is very popular in the 16th century. So Agrippa is very widely read. Basically, what happens is that this book becomes so well known that the association of the Templars with magic sticks. So you add to that the work of Jean Bodin. Bodin was a Renaissance political theorist, and he talked about the tendency of princes to treat minorities unjustly. And one of his examples is the suppression of the Templars. He sees this as no different than the persecution of Christians and Jews. So what happens is that the Templars now have this doubled identity in the popular opinion, this oppressed magic minority. Now, with the rise of Romanticism, this also influences how the Templars are looked at. After all, they're very dramatic. They're proud knights who are spiritual as well, but they were betrayed. How do you not get fascinated by a group like this? Antiquarians admired the Templars. Some of them did. Other antiquarians defended Philip the Fair fiercely. Oh, no, he didn't do anything wrong, right? So remember how we said conspiracy theories grew? Now, if you think about the romantic view of the Templars, the idea that emerges is that the Grand Masters possess secret spiritual illumination from the Essenes, who were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that these spirits were passed on via the material recovered from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So how did this happen, according to the legend? Supposedly, Jacques de Molay, who was the last Grand Master, just before his execution, sent a knight to the crypt where the secrets of the order were held. This happens to be a crypt in Paris where the Grand Masters were interred. He came back with a shroud, with a coffer full of the secrets, the crown of the kingdom of Jerusalem, the candlestick of the temple, and the 4 golden evangelists from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Supposedly there were 2 hollow columns in the crypt. Remind you of anything. It's like Saunier's church, right? These were filled with treasure as well. And according to the legend, all this treasure was carried safely to Scotland. This has a connection to Freemasonry, and we're going to talk more about that. Now, Rosslyn Chapel, as we see in the Da Vinci Code, is linked to the Templars erroneously, because it's not built for 170 years afterwards. Supposedly it bears a similarity to Solomon's Temple, but it doesn't really. The Sinclairs, or the St. Clairs, actually testified against the Templars when they were put on trial in Edinburgh. Don't get me started on Oak Island. I could say a lot about Oak Island. Maybe some of you have watched that terrible History Channel series, The Secret of Oak Island. Now, part of the myth is that the surviving Templars took revenge. So Louis XVI, the last Capetian who was killed by the Revolution, his death was supposedly masterminded by the Templars working through the Freemasons. There's an account from 1796 that claims that someone stood up at the king's execution and shouted, "Jacques de Molay has been avenged." Molay had supposedly, when he was burned, called out that both Philip and Clement would answer for their crimes within the year. And both of them did, in fact. The Pope died, and Philip's sons followed to Philip in early death very quickly. It was really an unfortunate series of events. This is the end of the direct Capetian line and the beginning of the Bourbon line. So, hindsight is a beautiful thing, but really, if you're looking back on it, it kind of does look like the Pope and the royal family paid for this kind of behavior, which, just strengthens the belief in the curse. Now, I want to skip ahead to 2002. So the scholar Barbara Frail is working in the Vatican's secret archives. And when I say secret archives, I don't mean secret archives. That's just a rough English translation of their Latin name. In fact, the secret archives can now be visited by ordinary scholars. What she found in this parchment, sheen on parchment, is that the Pope, the next year after the suppression, had actually absolved the Templar leaders. So perhaps he had felt bad about this. Now, did this impact anything? Of course not. All right, so Templars and the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment era is supposed to be all about the rejection of superstition, about governing life via rationality, and rejecting the institutions and beliefs of the Church. But at the same time, in the 18th century in particular, there's a great deal of nostalgia for knighthood. It was sort of seen as socially useful. It's a way of fostering collective identity for the nouveau riche, for example. This led to the development of new knightly orders and a revival of interest in the old, including the Templars. Now, it also setting for the rise of Freemasonry, which has all these connections to Templar history. We'll talk about that next week. Masonic stuff is only one of the threads of Neo-templarism. It's important and certainly worthy of individual examination, but we also have to recognize that the Templar legacy was put together in unique ways by other groups as well. So I mentioned the connection to Scotland, which is pseudo-historical in and of itself. So the legend has it that most of the Scottish Templars fled the Inquisition and joined Robert the Bruce's army, which was marching to repel the English attack on Scotland. This is during the 13th and 14th century wars of independence between Scotland and England. Bannockburn was the pivotal battle here, although independence wasn't recognized for another 10 years. Robert the Bruce's status was greatly enhanced by the victory. He becomes the great Scottish king, and justifiably so from what we can tell. He apparently showed great personal heroism in the battle. Now, the stories of the Templar involvement take on several forms. What's consistent across all versions is that they were, distinguishing themselves during the fight. So one source claims that after Bannockburn, a new Royal Order of Scotland was created, and that the Templars were admitted. We have no proof of this. There was also supposedly the Order of St. Andrew of the Thistle, created after Bannockburn, and the Order of Herodom, which may have been the same order, to which the Bruce supposedly had a personal connection. And the story says they actually absorbed the Templars, and they based their initiations on Templar tradition. Yeah. I mean, we do know that there are Scottish Neo-templars, and in fact they were excommunicated later on by John Markle Arminius, whom we will talk about. But, the Order of the Thistle was actually created, as far as we can tell, by James II in 1440. The Order of Herodom does not even date back that far. It may have been an 18th century creation. Certainly is not connected to Robert the Bruce at all. So, it's really hard to tell. A lot of the discussions, the documents discussing these were forgeries as well. And this is something we won't spend too much time talking about, but, it takes work and knowledge and care to figure out if something like a charter is real or just a really good copy of what a charter would look like. And when you're creating the background to a secret society, you have an incentive to make it look as good as possible. We kind of came across that with the Prior of Zion conspiracy. So we think a fair amount of that was going on here too. Now, the Larminius Charter. Okay, so Larminius supposedly calls a secret meeting of the survivors in 1324 and gave them what he called the Order of Transmission that proved that de Molay had named him as his successor. So this charter actually exists. It is a document in a cipher code. It's held by the Freemasons in London. If it's decoded, we can tell it's written in Latin, but not in ecclesiastical Latin, in very scholarly, polished Latin, which seems much more like 17th or 18th century Latin. So remember what I said about forgeries. Now, it emerged in the hands of the court doctor serving Napoleon in 1804, who has this great name that I just absolutely had to put on the slide because, listen to it, Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat. Does not sound like a Napoleonic-era doctor. He had the charter. He supposedly also had a copper box containing the Templar documents. He had de Molay's sword and his bones. One wonders who picked up de Molay's bones from the stake that day. He supposedly kept finding new things, too. He found a Greek manuscript that he called the Leviticon, which talked about Templar beliefs as Gnostic and Johannite. So the Johannite tradition is a heretical tradition, which believed that Christ was not the Messiah, that John the Baptist was sent with esoteric knowledge, which Jesus inherited. In some variants, the belief is that John was the true Son of God, and Jesus was the pretender. Now, what's the Templar connection? The Templars supposedly, amongst the relics they possessed in the Holy Land, had the head of John the Baptist. Now, there were many heads of John the Baptist, just as there are, enough pieces of the true cross to build a battleship. But, think about heads. Think about sacred heads or heads with strange powers. And then think about Bahamut, the brazen head. So, maybe that accusation was based on some weird misunderstanding or fabrication. having to do with a relic. It's hard to say. Now, Palaprat tried to create a new order of the Temple, and he condemned Scotch Templars as deserters. It was a way for the new order to try and denounce the Masonic Templars in a way of, trying to restore pure Templarism. So, I'm hoping this isn't unclear. You just think about it. You have the false histories, so the Scottish orders, Arminius' supposed excommunication of them, and you have the real history, which is Palaprat, creating his Nouveau Templars and creating this backstory where they were fighting with the Scots Templars for a long time. He has to justify why he should be in control, right? Now, we also have a German tradition. The German tradition centers on a group called the Ordo Novi Templi. They were a pre-World War I group, led by Guido von List and Jorg Lanz von Liebenfels. They believed in a secret Aryan priesthood possessing knowledge of magical runes from German and Scandinavian prehistory. Now, who did these priests become in the medieval period? You guessed it. They moved into the church and they became the Templars. Now, Lanz founded the Ordo Novi Templi in 1907, and one of the things he worked on was this belief system, Ariosophy. And if I had to sum up what Ariosophy was, I would say it's social Darwinist knighthood. Now, threads of this type of ideology are, of course, going to find their way into the mindset of certain infamous figures like Heinrich Himmler. Think about how well social Darwinist knights would fit the SS. Because it all ends in Nazis, always. No matter where you turn in this course, always not the Nazis. All right, so that brings us to the end of the actual lecture. A couple of words on your readings. Walker kind of completes the lecture. He will talk about what happens with the Templar myth in the 20th century. And yeah, of course, Bagent and Lee are involved. How could they not be? And when you read him, ask yourself, why he says the Templar myth is so popular. He seems to be Columbusing pseudohistory in a way. You guys all know what I mean by saying Columbusing, right? It's like he's the first person who's ever invented the concept. But, he's got some good thoughts worth focusing on. Now, Introvenia's Ordeal by Fire article, that's like a scary case study. And we will talk about that not on Monday, but on Wednesday, since we're doing the Conspiracy Theory Active Learning on Monday. And on Wednesday, we will talk about those readings, and we'll also do a little bit of an activity looking at Neo-Templar groups. Okay, folks, so that's it for me. This is the only lecture you're getting for next week. A little bit on the short side, but I'm sure none of you are too terribly upset by that. Your prompt is now up for this as well. I will see you all on Monday for some fun conspiracy theory discussion. Have a great weekend.